all the guided notes today. I want to do what your homework looks like, and then we're going to do some of these guided notes tomorrow. So please don't lose these. All right. Sometimes we encounter equations that have no real solutions. Okay? To rely on a number system with the imaginary unit, we indicate by the letter I. Okay? We can take square root of positive numbers, like the square root of 9 equals what?
3.
Because 3 squared equals 9, right? Technically, the correct answer is actually what?
Negative 3 and positive 3.
3 or negative 3, right? Because we know, but we try to find the square root of a negative number, like square root of negative 9. We can't do it because no number multiplied by itself gives you a negative. It has to be 3 times 3 is 9, or negative 3 times negative 3 is 9. So we're going to talk about a whole group of numbers that we call imaginary because they're all negative square roots. Okay? You guys with me so far? All right. So I stands for the square root of negative 1. And this is important. We have to go back to this over and over again. I squared. Now let's think about this. If we have the square root of negative 1 squared, what do we get? Negative 1. Okay. You can't put that in your calculator, but if you try, for example, the square root of 3 squared, we get 3. Okay? It removes it. The square root times the square gets rid of it. Okay? All right, so we're looking at the square root of negative 121. So let's split it into two things. One with a negative 1 and one with 121. So we're going to take it like this. We're going to have 121 times negative 1. Square root it. So what's the square root of 121? What times what gives me 121? 11. And we could take the square root of negative 1 and make that I. Right? Because the square root of negative 1 is just I. So let's try it with simplifying. This is like our warm-up today, our quick poll. What two numbers multiply to give us 28?
7 and 4.
7 and 4 is good. So we've got 4 times 7 times that negative 1, right? What's the square root of 4? 2. So I'm going to take the 2 out. What about the negative 1? Can I take that out too?
No.
Because that's what?
I.
I times the square root of 7. So that's my simplified version of the square root of negative 28. Did I lose some of you?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to do each of these in pieces. If I think of this as 2 square root 7, but I'm still timesing it by that square root negative 1, that square root negative 1 is turned into an I. So I put that I next to my 2. Because it's no longer under the square root, right? Because I know what it means. Yeah? Just like we took it out over here. All right. What's 5 times 2?
10.
And then we just have an I. We've got to think of that I sometimes like an X, except for when we do I squared. So we can't add things together, like, and we'll do a couple of those. We can't add I plus 3. It'll just be 3 plus I. But we can multiply them. Do we have a question? It just times it by a square root of negative 1, because it's not negative 1, right? It's the square root of negative 1, because that's an imaginary number.
So, wait,
Why would we ever have the square root of negative 1?
Yeah.
Didn't it come up when we did problems before? Here, let me give you an example. When we use the quadratic formula, didn't you guys sometimes get something crazy like negative 3 plus or minus the square root of negative 100 over 5? So this is an instance when we can use that. We can find my imaginary roots. Okay? Now, I'm not saying right now, I'm looking into when you're going to use this in real life, but right now, this is important because we have to know how to do this for our final exam and for our SAT. But I will look into when you would use imaginary numbers in real life. Okay, yes,
So if they're imaginary roots, then it has no roots.
right, only imaginary ones. There's a whole new imaginary plane we're going to talk about. So that means that everything, so remember I said there's not no roots, there's no real roots. There are always imaginary roots. Okay, so that's what we're going to get into. What is negative 3i times 2i? Negative 6i squared, but what, do I remember what I squared means? What does I squared mean? Look at the top of your paper. So this is the same as negative 6 times negative 1, right? Which would give me a, okay? So we have to remember those two things. If we have the square root of 1, that's I. And if we have I squared, that's just negative 1. Okay, those are hard things to get in our brain, but we need them. If we have I, that means the square root of negative 1. If we have I squared, that means times negative 1. Okay, now we're going to talk about complex numbers. It's a combination of a real number and an imaginary number. Okay, and we write it like A plus BI. So we always write the real number first, imaginary second. Okay. You can add and subtract complex numbers in the same way that you combine algebraic expressions. Keep your real terms and imaginary parts separate. Okay? So, I need your help. What can I combine? I'm adding these two things together. So what things can I add together?
Negative 2 and 1.
So negative 2 and 1 can be added together. What else?
5 and negative 7i.
5i and negative 7i. Okay, so let's do it. Negative 2 and 1 gives me negative 1, right? 5 minus 7i gives me, okay, and let's get rid of that plus minus there and just write negative 1 minus 2i. So we're kind of looking at I like it's an x, right? All right, now this one's tricky. I stuck a negative in there. Okay? So I'm going to go 4 minus a negative 1, right? Which is really, so that's what? Okay? So far, so good. Now I'm going to go 6 minus 2i. Gives me 4i. Okay? So I literally talk to myself when I do this. I go, okay, 4, and then I have to do minus negative 1i. Then I have to go 6 minus 2i. Right? I do the same thing with plus, but it's easier because I don't have to think about changing signs. You're going to have a bunch of problems like this on your homework tonight. Okay? So let's move on. We're going to skip graphing for today because you don't have any graphing homework tonight. And I'm going to do these 4 problems in class for your notes tomorrow. Okay? So we've moved on to, we're going to start some multiplication. When you multiply complex numbers, you use FOIL, or I like to use the box. Okay? You can use either one. I like the box. I feel like it keeps me organized. All right? Or any other method you're already familiar with. Then combine like parts. However, you must simplify I squared with a negative 1. Don't forget that. Okay, I'm going to do the first one with you, and then I'm going to ask you to do the second one on your own. Are you ready? You can totally FOIL. I like making the box. So I like to make my, it's kind of like a Punnett square, right? Where I put 2 and 4i on the outside, and 9 and negative 3i on the outside, but on the top. Okay, does it matter which one I put where? No, good. Okay, so now I am going to multiply these things. 2 times 9 gives me 18, good. 2 times negative 3i gives me, okay. 9 times 4 gives me 36i, right? Now here's the hard one. 4 times negative 3, 4i times negative 3i gives me negative 12i squared. But what does I squared stand for? So it's just 12. Good. Now that I have things filled into my boxes, I'm going to add the like terms together. 18 plus 12 gives me 30. 36i plus negative 6i gives me plus 30i. All right, guys, why don't you try the next one on your own, and I'm going to walk around whoever would like some extra help. Now we're doing one. Okay. So the negative is negative. All right, guys, let's go over it because we are still recording. Let's go over this problem, and then we're going to do some division, and then I'll be done. Okay, so again, I like the Punnett square. You can totally do FOIL. Don't feel like you have to do what I do. It's just, for me, it's real hard to not go back to my organizational roots to try to get it to work. I've got 1 and 4i. I've got 3 and negative 6i. 1 times 3 is 3. 1 times negative 6i is negative 6i. 4 times 3 is 12i. And then here's the hard part. 4 times negative 6 is negative 24i squared. But an I squared is a negative 1, so I get negative 24 times negative 1, which gives me a positive 24, right? Now I'm going to add things that go together. 3 plus 24 is 27. Negative 6i plus 12i is plus 6i. Okay, now I'm going to blow your mind with division. Okay, we cannot have an I on the bottom of the denominator. We're good with this? Okay. So we absolutely cannot have an I on the bottom of the denominator. The conjugate, okay? So you know, like if we have a square root on the bottom of the denominator, we can't do it. So instead of timesing it by itself, we times it by its conjugate, its negative answer. Okay? Instead of A plus BI, it's A minus BI. Okay? So let's think about this together. If we have I for our first problem on the bottom, we're going to times it, the top and bottom by, not I, but negative I. Okay? So, 2 times negative I is negative 2I, right? Negative I times 3 is negative 3I squared, which means it's negative 2I. Negative 3 times negative 1 gives me 3. Okay, so that's just the top. The bottom. I times negative I is negative I squared. So that's like negative times a negative 1, which gives me, that's my final answer. Now, each one of these division problems are totally different. So I want to make sure I go over each one. You'll have ones like these on your homework, okay? So, let's look at the next one. Any questions about the first one before I move on? So I'm literally like distributing the negative I, right? Negative I times 2 is negative 2I. Negative I times 3I is negative 3I squared. Remember, I squared is negative 1. Negative 3 times negative 1 is positive 3. Okay. Negative I squared, we have that negative on the outside, times it by a negative 1, and we get 1. All right, let's look at number 2. What is the conjugate of 1 plus 2I? Yes, 1 minus 2I. And we have to times it by the top and the bottom. Okay. If we look at the top, we could just distribute the 8. Agreed? So 8 times 1 is 8 times negative 2I is, okay, that one's part's done, right? So I'm just keeping that there. I'm going to make a box for the bottom because it's a 2-term times a 2-term. You could FOIL instead. I've got 1 and 2I. I've got 1 and negative 2I. So I have to be real careful. 1 times 1 is 1 times negative 2I is negative. 1 times 2I is 2I, right? Now here's where it gets tricky. 2 times negative 2 is negative 4I squared, which is the same thing as negative 4 times negative 1, right? So what am I going to put in the box? 4. Okay, now we're going to add things together. 2I plus negative I means these go away, right? 4 plus 1 is? That's my answer. Weird, huh? Lots of steps. On the homework tonight, like 3 or 4. Okay, you ready for the next?
No.
Should I go over this one again first? Okay. Are we okay with the top? We just distributed the 8. 8 times 1 and 8 times negative 2I.
Yes.
Okay, stop me when you get confused. We've got 1 times 2I times 1 times negative 2I. So I built a box, right? Because I have 2-term by 2-term. 1 times 1 is 1. 1 times negative 2I is negative 2I. 1 times 2I is 2I. Now, here's where it gets crazy. Negative 2 times 2 is a negative 4. I times I is I squared. I squared is Negative 4 times negative 1 is a positive. Okay, now we add everything that goes together. 2i and negative 2i cancel each other out. That's a 0, right? 1 plus 4 gives me 5. Good? Okay. Let's look at the next one. Now, what is the conjugate that I have to times the top and bottom by? 1 plus I over 1 plus I. Do I have 2 term times 2 term? So I'm going to have how many boxes that I make? So I'm going to make one set of Punnett square. I'm going to have to make another one. So I'm going to do the top first, and then I'm going to do the bottom. What am I going to put on the outside of my Punnett square?
2 and
Yep, doesn't matter which, if you put one on the side or one not. 2 times 1 is? 2 times I is? Good. 1 times I is? I times I is? Which is the same thing as? Okay. 2 plus negative 1 is? Okay. And then 2i plus I is? Good. All right, now I'm going to find my bottom. Do I need to slow down? Are we okay with getting that answer? Do you want me to back up or anything? Okay, I'm going to move on then. I'm going to do the next Punnett square. We've got 1 minus I and 1 plus I. 1 times 1 is? 1 times I is? 1 times negative I is? Negative I, right? Negative I times I is negative I squared. So that's negative times a negative 1, which is a? So 1 plus 1 is? Negative I plus I is 0. So this is my final answer. How are we feeling? Okay. I want to do A right here at the bottom, just so you guys, and then I'll do the rest tomorrow, okay? But I just want you guys to get where this comes from, and you could totally try these. All right, I'm going to take the square root of both sides, right? So I get rid of x squared. And I get x equals the square root of negative 16. So that's x equals the square root of 16 times the square root of negative 1. What's the square root of 16? Okay. What's the square root of negative 1? I. That's it. So you can totally try those problems below. And then there is homework for tonight, 12 through 30 all. So we are going to graph tomorrow in class. We're going to do 1 through 4 in the graphing section. And we're going to do these numbers. I would like you to start your homework right now. There are books up front. Please get them out. I am still recording, but I'm going to stop in just a second. Again, the homework is 279, 12 through 30 all.